It's very fortunate that I'm following Antonio Damasio because he very elegantly introduced the whole context to my talk. But important business first, which is to learn how to move the... Okay. I'm pushing that one. Okay. Okay, this is to thank some of my collaborators on the work I'm going to describe, not all of them, and the others are important others, but noticeably Chris Frith. Now, Antonio introduced the idea of the internal milieu and the regulation of the internal milieu being very, very important to human consciousness, and I want to really expand upon that in my talk. And the regulation of the human internal milieu is accomplished by many feedback loops to the brain, of which arguably the most important is that mediated via the autonomic nervous system. Here we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. And any perturbation to the human being encountered with the environment invariably engages this system. And this idea of the internal milieu standing in dynamic relationship with the external world was pointed out by Claude Bernard in the 19th century. I hope that's legible. This is what Bernard said. He said, so far from the higher animal being indifferent to the external world, it is, on the contrary, in a precise and informed relation with it, in such a way that its equilibrium results from a continuous and delicate compensation established as by the most sensitive of balances. So here he was making the point that all organisms are in dynamic relationship with the environment. It follows that any perturbations of this milieu by objects in the world, which would include art objects, is registered in awareness as much as their sensory apprehension. It's this perturbation of, in awareness that I want to address with respect to the question, is it relevant to consciousness? And the appeal I'm going to make initially is not to science, but to the arts. Probably the most vocal appeal came in recent times comes from this poem. And this is J.M. Coetzee's, the Nobel laureate's novel, Elizabeth Costello. Elizabeth Costello is a fictional author, now in the sort of prime of her life, in her late 60s, early 70s. And she's invited to deliver a lecture, which she entitles The Lives of Animals. And Costello contrasts the consciousness of reason with what she refers to, and this is quoting from her lecture, fullness, embodiedness, the sensation of being. Not a consciousness of yourself as a ghost, as a kind of ghostly reasoning machine thinking thoughts, but on the contrary, the sensation, a heavily affective sensation of being a body with limbs that have extension in space, of being alive to the world. This fullness contrasts starkly with Descartes' key state, which has an empty feel to it, the feel of a pea rattling around in a shell. Thus, Coetzee, his fictional alter ego, raises the paradox that embodiedness, the representation of our bodies and our brains, is the bedrock of our mental lives. The key point is that bodily and mental states are intimately conjoined within consciousness. And of course, this idea has echoes all the way back to William James and has been most elegantly articulated and extended in recent times by my co-speaker, Antonio Damasio. What I want to do now is take an extended example from the arts to make the point that bodily states provide the basis for a rich evocation of subjective consciousness. And if you look at the neurosciences, you would get an entirely different view, I think, that consciousness has to do with sensory awareness. So this is a different twist to things. So what I will then do is provide an account of what we understand about how these bodily or subjective conscious states are represented in the brain. So although the former is concerned primarily with the visual arts, I tend to take a degree of license and use an example from literature. My example is taken from one of the seminal figures of modernity, namely James Joyce. And the specific example is taken from his short story, The Dubliners. On the surface, the story is a tribute to the generous embrace of Irish hospitality, and it's largely taken up with an account of an annual dinner dance hosted by the principal character Gabriel Conroy's great-aunts to celebrate the Feast of the Epiphany. In the deeply moving final section, when Gabriel and his wife Greta leave the party and return to their hotel, Joyce's exquisite power to represent an individual consciousness is given full rein. The account is not of a ghostly mental consciousness, but of a heavily affective consciousness. It foreshadows the extended account of an individual consciousness provided in his most famous work, Ulysses, which I would also suggest is very much an embodied consciousness. So, on leaving the party, Gabriel's state is of expectation that he and Greta, his wife, are away from their children, and that an intimacy may occur in the hotel. And this is registered as, quote, "A wave of yet more tender joy escaped from his heart and went coursing in a warm flood along his arteries. Like the tender fires of stars, moments of their life together that no one knew or would ever know of broke upon and illumined his memory." Alighting from a cab outside their hotel, Gabriel's awareness of Greta, his representation of her in consciousness, is described in terms of the impact of her corporeal presence, as she, quote, "leans on his arm as lightly as when she had danced with him a few hours before. He'd felt proud and happy then, happy that she was his, proud of her grace and wifely carriage. But now, after the kindling again of so many memories, the first touch of her body, musical and strange and perforant, sent through him a keen pang of lust." Mounting the stairs of the hotel, Gabriel's state of anticipation is described again as a physical urge. Quote, "He could have flung his arms around her hips and held her still, for his arms were trembling with desire to seize her, and only the stress of his nail against the palms of his hands held the wild impulse of his body in check." Gabriel's expectations soon dissolve into disappointment when Greta, being pressed as to why she seemed so distant from him, recounts that a song heard earlier in the evening had brought back to him the memory of Michael Fury, her first boyfriend, who died on her account, having cycled a considerable distance to sing the song The Lass of Aughrim outside her window. Gabriel's state is now described as a, quote, "vague terror," as if at the hour that he hoped to triumph, some impalpable and vindictive being was coming against him, gathering forces against him in its vague world. In the final moving section of the story, Greta sobs herself to sleep, and Joyce describes how, as she slept, Gabriel's state is not what one might expect of anger, but of deep empathy towards his wife, as, quote, "his curious eyes rested long upon her face and on her hair, and as he thought of what he must have been then, in that time of her first girlish beauty, a strange, friendly pity for her entered his soul. He didn't like to say even to himself that her face was no longer beautiful, but he knew it was no longer the face for which Michael Fury had braved death." Joyce then relates that, quote, "generous tears filled Gabriel's eyes. He had never felt like that himself towards any woman, but he knew that such a feeling must be love." And as Gabriel himself drifts off to sleep, his fading consciousness is described as, quote, "his own identity was fading out into a grey, impalpable world. The solid world itself was dissolving and dwindling." The key point I want to make here is that Joyce's depiction of Gabriel's consciousness, which is one of the finest in the English literature, is conveyed through a range of emotions, sentiments, and bodily sensations he experiences. His consciousness is first and foremost embodied, part of what Joyce says is the solid world. So moving on from literature, or from the arts, to science. The point I've made is that perturbations in your body are registered in awareness, and the question for scientists is, how are these perturbations registered? And a very simple account of this is an experiment we did a number of years ago where we got subjects to do two types of tasks. One, a mental task, two, a physical task, so depicted here. And all these tasks engender changes in your bodily state, registered by a change in your heart rate, blood pressure, skin conductance. And what we're interested in is how are these changes in your bodily state manifest as a change in your heart rate registered in the brain. And what we show is really depicted down here in green. And the point I want to make is that, as Antonio Damasio pointed out, quite a widespread group of areas in the brain are activated. What we can then do as scientists is take that readout of your heart rate and decompose it into its individual components. And what we've done here is decomposed it into the low frequency components, which reflect primarily the sympathetic fight, flight type of responses. And we can show that activity in the brain related either to the generation of those states or the representation of them as they're registered in your body involves structures, but particularly this structure here, the anterior cingulate cortex, and these structures here called the anterior insular cortex. And the next question is, of course, these systems could be part of the generative or part of the representational aspects of these bodily states. And if we take patients, say, who have suffered trauma or lesions to the anterior cingulate cortex, what we can show is that they no longer generate bodily states in relation to physical or mental stress, suggesting that that is how central apprehension of effort or stress generates appropriate biobehavioral bodily responses. And we can take the other side of the coin and we can ask, well, what if you lesioned all of this system? How would that change the brain response to perturbations that engender states of arousal? And fortunately, we were able to study a very rare group of patients who suffered what's called pure autonomic failure, whose peripheral sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems have deteriorated. And we can then ask the question of how does that influence their general consciousness? And what it doesn't do, it doesn't affect in any way their core intellectual functions. But what we can show, and I don't want you to really focus on this too much, is that their emotional experience of the world is slightly dulled. It's clipped. It is not as felt as you or I, assuming that we're normal, our experience of the world. And if we look at those subjects and ask where, when we give them an emotional provoking context or situation, where is there a difference in their brain with respect to normal subjects, we see the key structures, the amygdala, but more strikingly here, the anterior insular cortex. So this has led us to pursue the line that the representation of internal bodily states, being aware of your own current state, is intimately tied up with the functions of this part of the brain, the insula, which is depicted here in an anatomical slice. And what I'm showing you here are anatomical summaries of critical feedback loops to the insular cortex. And it's striking that in human beings, there seems to be the development, as Bud Craig has pointed out, of a specific spinal pathway that feeds back into the insula that may well be important in representing awareness of the current internal milieu or current state of the body. So if that thesis is correct, then if we take subjects and give them a particular task which depends upon awareness of their internal state, what parts of the brain are recruited? And our prediction, of course, is that it will be the insula. Now, to do this is a very difficult task, but there are subjects who have awareness of their internal states. And those subjects are what are called, you can classify them as good heartbeat detectors. So they know when their heart beats, and they can tell very, very precisely. And what we did in this experiment is we asked these subjects, who we specifically selected, to attend to their heartbeat, and we had a control situation where they had to attend to a note. And what they had to say was whether the note was synchronous or not with their heartbeat. And sometimes it was, and sometimes it was desynchronized. There was a separation. And that's a very, very difficult task to do. And without going into the details of the task, what we were doing is increasing the demands upon interoceptive awareness. And we're interested in what specific regions of the brain are engaged. And to cut a long story short, the right anterior insula showed a highly specific correlation with the ability to be able to perform this interoceptive task. Now, we know that the body image is highly malleable, and it can be changed. And one of the interesting examples of how the body image can be changed and how things can be incorporated into the body image is given by a famous illusion called the rubber hand illusion. And in simple terms, if you get a subject to rest and put out their hand, but you occlude their hand with a plate, say, for example, and what you provide them is vision of a rubber hand, roughly where their own hand might be, but it's separated in space. And if you then occasionally touch the occluded hand, what subjects will experience is actually what has been touched is the rubber hand. They will attribute their sensory experience to this artificial limb, and that is called the rubber hand illusion. And you can modify this experiment by giving subjects touching the subjects in such a way that sometimes it will generate the illusion and sometimes it will not. And we can ask the question, when subjects are looking at this illusionary hand, and occasionally we now threaten that illusory hand with a very sharp needle. So it's not their own body that's been threatened, it is a rubber hand. And what we can show is that this experience of threatening a rubber hand with a needle will generate a defense-like response. And among the sort of defense-like responses, of course, is anxiety is a defense to threat. And we can show that there is an increase in anxiety in this type of situation. And subjects have a very strong and powerful sense that that hand is their own. And we can show that when the rubber hand is threatened, you get an activation in the brain in the anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex. That is quite similar to when, I'm having difficulty reading this, when their real hand is threatened. So if we do the same experiment and we threaten the real hand, we can show that the response in the brain is virtually identical. And we can carry out a more specific analysis and ask, when the rubber hand is threatened, does the subject's own degree of threat correlate with changes in the brain, and if so, where in the brain? And again, what we can show is that this correlates with changes in the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula, both on the left and also on the right. A different slice, it is also present on the right. So this shows that the incorporation of an illusionary object into the body is fully incorporated into the body scheme, and that these illusions possibly depend not upon any sensory integration, but actually upon a much more deep-seated integration into the body scheme that includes the full range of biobehavioral responses you would have to your own body. So in the final part of the talk, I want to show how we've extended these findings to look at something called empathy. Now, empathy is obviously a very important aspect of human emotion, and the definition of it I like, put in a nutshell here, is from Susan Langer. And her definition is that empathy is an involuntary breach of individual separateness. And empathy is different than sympathy. Sympathy I can have or display without actually feeling anything for somebody else. Empathy is when you feel somebody else's pain, when seeing your child being hurt actually hurts you as well. If the insular cortex is important in representing one's own internal emotional state, then it follows that it may also be important in representing the state of others. And the way we approach this is to do the following type of experiment. And can we just run the movie by clicking on this? If you just click the mouse on the image. So what we do is we have couples come along to the experiment. We took couples, girlfriend, boyfriend, and we studied the female who was in the scanner watching her partner being exposed to pain. And the pain could be of two sorts, could be high pain or low pain. And the person himself also got high pain or low pain. And by subjecting, have you clicked on it? Yeah, here. So by subjecting the person themselves to pain, we could map out the pain matrix in the brain. But by looking at what happens when they observe their partner receiving pain, we could ask, is there any commonality in the brain response when I experience pain, real physical pain, as to when I have an empathetic response to my partner receiving pain? So this is what the subject in the scanner would see. So now they're seeing that their partner is going to get pain. And of course, at the end of the experiment, subjects felt quite a considerable bit of distress when their partner received pain. So here are the brain responses. What you're seeing in green and red here, you can take to be the parts of the brain that are activated when subjects perceive pain. And the question is, what parts of the brain are activated in common when I receive pain and when I perceive my partner in pain? And the striking finding is that anterior cingulate cortex and bilateral insula are engaged when I perceive my partner in pain, the same regions as would be engaged as when I receive pain myself. As I outlined, this experiment involved couples, but we know our degree of empathy can be modified by our experience of others. So whether somebody's been good to you, bad to you, whether they've been properly behaved, may modify our responses. And so to take this a little bit further, and this is the last experiment I'm going to describe, what we did is we got subjects to come to the lab. And this time, while they were waiting around for the experiment that we're going to have, we had them play economic games with other partners. And these other people were actually stooges. So the person having the experiment did not realize this. And to cut a long story short, in these economic games, one of the people behaved very nicely, reciprocated. The other person behaved not so nicely, did not reciprocate in these economic exchanges. So they were viewed by the subjects as bad. And what we're doing here is this is the economic game that they engaged in. This is the experimental setup. And this is just showing that people's appraisal of people changed as a function of how the other person treated them, whether they behaved fairly or unfairly. And the question then is, how does this alter one's empathetic response, both at a behavioral level, which we see here, but also at the level of the brain? Does one's experience with another modify the degree of empathy evoked in the brain in empathetic mediating regions when one sees somebody who's good or bad to you being subject to pain? And what I'm showing you here is a response for women and to men for the fair player or for the unfair player. Fair player, unfair player. And this is mapping out the responses in anterior insular cortex and anterior cingulate cortex. And again, to cut a long story short, is there was some modulation when women saw unfair people being shocked, but it wasn't significant. They still had an empathetic response, though it was attenuated. However, in men, what you're seeing here is the empathetic response was completely blocked. And that has, of course, very important implications for lots of things in society. And more worryingly, of course, men in this situation subjectively rated that when they saw the unfair person being shocked, they got actually a high degree of pleasure, or they felt vengeance. And interestingly, that correlated with engagement of this structure here, called the nucleus accumbens, a key part of the brain that we know is involved in reward and motivation. And again, that speaks to very, very complex issues which I'm not going to dwell on. So what I want to do is to finish, hopefully on time, so I'd hate to be ticked off. So what I want to do is to return to the arts very, very briefly and to suggest that actually what neuroscience is discovering about consciousness, that consciousness and self-awareness are very much tied up with being embodied, with feeling states, is something actually that artists have known explicitly or implicitly for a long period of time. And probably I think the nicest depiction of this, and I hope this projects, is in W.H. Auden's poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats. And this was written just after Yeats died, and it's a very, very generous poem to one of his contemporaries. And this is just one stanza describing what he imagined was the moment when Yeats actually died. So he says, "But for him, it was his last afternoon as himself, an afternoon of nurses and rumours. The provinces of his body revolted, the squares of his mind were empty, silence invaded the suburbs, the current of his feeling faded. He became his admirers." Thank you very much.